webinar of our TrustMatters series hosted by Trusted Advisor Associates in partnership with the Get Real project. This webinar is the 2020 Trust Audit, the 3 anchors for bolstering your business. It's going to be hosted by Charles H. Green. He's the CEO and founder of Trusted Advisor Associates and co-author of the Trusted Advisor book. So this is the 10th webinar in our TrustMatters series. You are going to receive a link with the recording, presentation, and all sorts of resources related to the webinar right after the webinar. And we have a couple of features that you can use to communicate with us. There's a chat feature for general comments, but we have a new Q&A feature. This is located in your navigation panel, probably on the bottom of your Zoom navigation, and you can ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll pause the webinar to a certain point and ask questions, and at the end we'll have a Q&A. We also have a couple polls that are going to pop up. If you want to learn more about our webinars, you can go to Trusted Advisor Associates /webinars, and we'll pop over to the next slide. Our next webinar is coming up in April on the 21st. It's hosted by Andrea Howe, who's the founder of the Get Real project, and the subject is how to influence a skeptical audience using 3 simple steps. So I'm going to hand it over to Charles H. Green. He's going to take it over from here.
Hey, excuse me. Thank you, Jason. Welcome, everybody. Very quick advertisement about us. Trusted Advisor Associates, been in business for 20 years. You can see the 3 books here. We do workshops, online learning, a bunch of other stuff, and we're about to get into it here. We build this as an audit, in the sense not of a financial audit, but of kind of taking the beginning of the year to step way back and take a 30,000-foot look. Think of it as spring cleaning, a way to review the several models that we have and help you think in your team, your organization, what can I do with this trust stuff, okay? Let me start off at a really big picture. Actually, I just want to shout out a little bit to some of the people on here before we jump into it. We got an interesting bunch of some past clients, some new ones. So I just want to shout out to MITRE, one of our longest standing clients, folks from Cavio, WestEd, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Willard Agriculture we got here today, Ramboll, and a couple of personal connections. We got somebody here from one of my favorite banks in the world, Bangor Savings Bank. And thanks to Andy Lecter for rounding up some of the folks in Atlanta at Savills. So welcome everybody, and please don't be offended if I didn't mention your name. Anyway, I want to start off really big picture. You hear the word trust a lot in the news these days, and I would suggest it is one of the sloppier terms out there. It's up there with motherhood and apple pie. And I want to start just by giving some very helpful, I think, definitions for how to think about it. At the core of it all is interpersonal trust, the nature of a trust relationship between 2 individual people, human beings, right? And that's mostly what we're going to talk about. And I think it's the strongest form and the clearest form of trust. But let's be clear, we also casually use the word trust in connection with corporations, corporate entities, the FedExes, the Googles of the world. And it's not quite as clean. I mean, it's one thing to say, I trust Jason, to kick off the webinar here. It's quite another thing to say, I trust FedEx. Well, kind of to do what? And then way over further at the realm of sloppy, unorganized, unclear thinking, we talk about trust in institutions. And you see lots of very specific 2 decimal point data about whether our trust in the political system or the police force or the Department of Justice or politicians has gone up or down by 2.3 percentage points. Here's the thing, the closer you get to the left, the more clear and precise and actionable we can be. The closer you get to the right, the more vague it's going to be. So I'd like to offer you one test question. Anytime you see stuff towards the right, ask yourself, trust to do what? And if you can't get a very clear answer, like if somebody says, well, trust in the justice system in Argentina is low compared to France, what does that really mean? I mean, there's a lot of apples and oranges, lack of specificity. So when you see trust out in the press there, don't forget to ask to do what. If I wrote the dictionary, which of course I don't, I would restrict the word trust far over to the left, because the pure paradigm is kind of interpersonal trust. Gets a little sloppier when we get over to corporate. I kind of would prefer the word reputation. And when we get way over to the right, I wish that we use words more like confidence. But the fact is, I don't control, how people use the words. I don't control the dictionary. We do use the word trust all the time but it gets a little sloppier as we get to the right. Okay, that's the 30,000 foot context, or even higher if you take the outer space view. Let's dive in. I want to talk about 3 trust models that we've developed here in the 3 books that you saw, the most recent one co-authored by Andrea Howe and myself, and 3 models. The first one, the trust equation, which I'm going to guess most of you on this call are pretty familiar with, that has to do with trustworthiness. Now, if you think about a trust relationship in that interpersonal way, it happens when the following things are in place. It's 2 persons. One person, the trustor, takes a risk to trust the other person. The other person then proves themselves trustworthy or not. And if they 2 connect, then you click up the level of trust that exists in that relationship between those 2 people. It is and that's how trust progresses. One of the big myths about trust is trust takes time and it accumulates over time. Not really. It happens in moments that matter, to borrow somebody's phrase, and it kind of kicks up in step functions. So trustworthiness is what the trust equation is about. And I suggest the word virtues. I think it kind of works for when we talk about trustworthiness. Second model has to do more with behaviors, and it's how you create trust. I wish we had a better acronym than LFEC. We don't. It stands for Engage, Listen, Frame, Envision, Commit. We'll get into that. But that's about creating trust. And the third one has more to do with scaling trust. And this gets into issues of leadership and team building and how do you create a trust-based organization. And with respect to that, that's more of a values issue, a values kind of a model. We call it the 4 trust principles. Very quick dot point on each of those 3, and then I'm going to ask you which ones you want to spend the most time on today. So, oh, by the way, those no, hang on, Jason, not yet. Can you pull that back?
I don't think I can undo it once it's done.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
I'd like, just based on my simple description so far, you got a quiz on your screen here. Which one of those 3 models would you like me to spend the most time on today? I'm going to cover all 3. This is a question of what you'd like to see emphasized the most, because I'm going to course correct as we go through it. All right, I'm watching the numbers come in. Good, interesting. All right, and we got about 20 of you left. Click in. And then Jason, you can show the results in, I'd say, about 5 seconds or so. I think we'll have enough. Okay, there we are. 50% of you, 49, said let's focus most on creating trust. And interesting, only 10 of you, 18% more focus on trustworthiness. That tells me most of you are familiar with the trust equation. So I'm going to zip through that part really quickly. And then in the middle, we've got scaling trust organization. All right, I got my marching orders. We're going to talk most about the creating trust part. Okay, thanks, Jason. Let's see if I can pull it off. All right, so moving right along, those first 2 models are very much about the personal trust at the left hand of the scale that I showed you earlier. The scaling trust has more to do with organizational trust, so it bleeds into the second one. So very quickly, what does the trust equation address? How to think concretely about trustworthiness, how to improve your own trustworthiness score, and how to think about others' trustworthiness. What does that trust creation model, the LFEC model, address? It is the steps to trust creation. We're going to touch on the biggest obstacle to trust creation and the most important part of it, and have a clear point of view about how to think about that. The third one, those trust principles in that model, that really addresses how you scale trust, how you build it up across more than just 2 people, and what's key to leadership and what's key to building a trust-based team or organization. And we just did this, and we got your results. And most of you said, let's do number B. So that's what I'm going to take the most time on today. All right, so I'm going to zip through the trust equation. Apologies if you've already seen it, but I think I may have a few extra twists, but I'm going to go fast through this part. I touched on earlier, when you hear people talk about trust, remember there's a trustor that does the trusting. There is a second party who is trustworthy or not, and if that clicks, you get trust. And if you don't know which problem you're trying to solve, trusting or being trustworthy, good luck. We need to clarify. You can't be a trusted advisor without learning how to do both of those things, not just being trustworthy, but trusting as well. We focus quick on being trustworthy. the trustworthiness equation. I'm sure almost all of you are familiar with it. Credibility plus reliability plus intimacy, all divided by self-orientation. Very quickly, credibility is about words, expertise, credentials. In a sentence, we might say, I can trust what she says about this particular subject matter. By contrast, reliability has much more to do with actions. I can trust him to do this particular thing. I can trust Jason to tee up the slides, to handle the intro, to be ready to go on the questions and so forth. Then we get very different. Intimacy, which kind of has to do with safety, mostly emotional safety. And in a sentence, we might say, I can trust her with this information, meaning she'll treat it with respect and out of concern for my situation. I can trust her with this kind of comment. All three of those are in the numerator. The denominator factor, which drives it the other way, is self-orientation. And this has to do with motives and attention, in particular, caring. And there are two kinds of self-orientation. One, the obvious selfishness. I'm not going to spend much time on it. Obviously, we don't trust people who appear to us to be selfish. That's fairly well understood. The more common and relevant version of high self-orientation, which is bad, is not selfishness. It is neurotic self-preoccupation, all the time worrying. How am I doing? Am I going to get the sale? Will they like me, et cetera, et cetera.
Hey, Charlie, I'm going to
yes.
pause you for 1 second. There's a little bit of a clicking in your audio. I'm not sure if it's your mic.
I bet it's my mic. Thank you. I'll try and hold it carefully.
Okay, no problem.
Thanks. Think of those first two components as kind of rational, meaning you can collect data, you can define behaviors. The other two, for lack of a better term, are emotional, which means we kind of have to deconstruct what it's like. Every situation is unique, very hard to translate into behaviors, and especially difficult to come up with metrics. So very different components. As many of you know, we did develop a self-assessment version of the trust equation called the Trust Quotient, or TQ for short. I'm going to share just a couple of quick headlines from 70,000 people who took that TQ, including probably many of you on this call. One of the more interesting ones is who scores higher, men or women. Turns out, by a statistically significant amount, it's women. Women score more highly on that trustworthiness quiz. And it turns out most of the reason for women outperforming men is women score higher on one particular variable. And if you think about it, you can probably guess it. It is the intimacy factor. Men and women are about the same on, reliable, knowledgeable. We're equally neurotic, if you will, but it's that intimacy factor. You can see quite a difference there. Age, everybody's interested in. What happens to our trust scores as we age? And everybody kind of guesses this one. Yes, they go up. That was actually the strongest correlation in our database. Now, here's a couple other interesting things. There are other groups, Yankelovich, Pew, Gallup, that do surveys of most and least trusted professions. Guess who turns out in almost all of these surveys all the time is the #1 most trusted profession? Turns out it's nursing. And if you think about the characteristics of an effective nurse, first of all, it's 89% female in the United States. But whether you're talking about a male nurse or a female nurse, doesn't matter. Probably the key component for being a successful nurse, I would argue, is being really good at the intimacy component. Put all that stuff together, and it's no surprise that when you run a regression analysis on the data, turns out that the factor of intimacy is slightly more powerful than all the others. We hadn't thought about it when we wrote the book 20 years ago. But I think we kind of intuitively assumed probably it was self-orientation. But if you level them all, turns out it's intimacy. And that's a big lesson that many of you who have been through our workshops know very well. We end up spending a lot of time on that. Now, let's get into the section. Well, let me just stop there and ask if there are any questions or comments on the first of those three models, the trust equation.
I don't see any questions that popped up, but just to remind everybody, there's a question and answer feature. If you do have questions, it should be on your navigation. Feel free to use that.
Jason, did I get rid of the clicking?
Yep, you sound a lot better. That was the issue.
Good, thank you.
Actually, somebody asked the question, remind us why intimacy. I think we're going to get a little deeper into that.
Well, it's a good, we will get into that a little bit, but why intimacy? Well, if you think about trust-based relationships, there's clearly an emotional component to that. And yes, there's a rational component to it too. We want people to be competent, expertise. We certainly want them to be reliable, live up to their word. We don't trust people who seem to be wrapped up in themselves, but we kind of especially trust people with whom we feel some kind of bond. And that's largely what we call intimacy. It covers a lot of things like empathy, like vulnerability, like emotional intelligence. And it's not surprising when you think about it that one might actually turn out to be statistically more powerful than the others. I'm not sure how to answer it more than giving that sort of definition and repeating that when you run a regression analysis on that 70,000 data set, that actually comes out with the highest R squared.
And actually, there's one more comment that if you
Yeah.
go back to the gender differentiation chart,
Yes.
somebody was questioning if there's really a difference because they're mentioning it's only 1 point, but
Well, thank you for mentioning that, whoever that was. You're right. It's a 1.0 difference on a 100 scale, 83.3 versus 82.3. Remember, this is 70,000 data points on a forced binary question. Heads or tails, on or off, up or down, black or white. And on that level, if you run the statistical relevance questions, it's about 1.5 standard deviations worth of difference. So any statistician will tell you they'll take that to the bank. That's pretty reasonable. It's statistically significant, I guess. I'm not a statistician, so I can't go a lot deeper than that. But it's more important than that 1.0 number might look. Hope that's helpful. Okay, so let's move into what you all expressed the most interest in. How do you create trust? How does it work? I mean, again, we're talking about interpersonal trust one-on-one here. I guess the first thing to say is it happens in conversations. Yeah, there's certain kinds of trust that, from afar, you mail in a resume to get a job and somebody looks at it and they say, oh, I know that school, or they got good grades, or, nice track record, etc. But most of the trust, the powerful interpersonal trust that we're talking about, happens in interactions. And maybe they can be a little bit on chat, a little bit by email, but the ultimate is sort of face-to-face, full bandwidth, if you will, interaction. So largely that's what a conversation looks like. Our little model, our LFLEC model, consists of 5 parts. Engage, which is when you connect on something and you agree, let's talk about this particular issue. This includes all the, where'd you go to school, and isn't the weather nice in Milwaukee right now, etc. But it's basically you kind of focus on some issue. The second step, the L, listening, and the phrase here, tell me more, is kind of a best practice for listening. Those of us who are in sort of consultative, interactive, trusted advisor-ish kinds of roles, the temptation is to look at this as a source of problem solving. Get the data, advance the conversation. That phrase, tell me more, is a very different kind of phrase. It expresses interest and focus on the other. Third step in this model, we call framing, and it's kind of coming down to problem definition at hand. In a sense, everything leads up to this point, and we tend to put a lot of emphasis on, what is the issue? Let's nail it down and agree upon it. Well, that's the third step here. Fourth one you often don't see in models like this, and the suggestion is that we all ought to take a little bit of time in our conversations with our clients to stop and step back and say, listen, let's think about what the world's going to look like when we finish doing what we're talking about doing. It's really easy to get stuck in the details and forget to every once in a while zoom up and remember why we're doing this. There's, I'll mention kind of an aside, the ballroom dance business of all things. It's a very scripted, mechanical sales process, but they do one thing very, very well. They insist that the dance teachers, twice a lesson, take a moment at the beginning, at the end, and have a quick conversation with the customer. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because you signed up for the social level program, and the objective of that program is that you can go to a wedding and you can get up in front of all your friends and not only not embarrass yourself, but have people compliment you. And then you go and do the lesson. And again, at the end, you come back and say, here, why are we doing this? And again, you talk about the ultimate end goal of being at a wedding, that kind of a thing. And finally, the last step we call commit, which is the usual action steps. What do we do next? And so forth. So engage, listen, frame, envision, commit. Stupid acronym, LFEC. I know. I wish we had a better, but it's too late. The book's already written, so don't tell me. Now, I would suggest to you, this is kind of based on just 20 years of doing this. The biggest cause of failed trust, not just my opinion, but in mine, it's this. There is a cause, and it's this: accelerating way too rapidly to the solution. Now think about this. I'm sure 95% of you on this call today, we're in the business of helping our clients and customers solve problems, right? And we've been hired to do that. We aspire to do that. We get trained to do that. Solve that problem. First define it, then solve it. And we're very much driven by that kind of a view. The problem is this: if the client, the person on the other end, feels like they're kind of just an obstacle on the way to you solving this brilliant intellectual puzzle, they feel trivialized, not paid attention to. Just something along the way of your mental exercise. This, by the way, is underscored. About 10 years ago, I had a day-long conversation with Neil Rackham, the author of Spin Selling. And he said much the same thing. In fact, I have a slide on it a little bit later. He says this is the #1 problem in selling. This urge to hurry up and solve the problem. It actually gets in the way and causes failed sales, just like I would argue it causes failed trust. So our need, which by the way comes from great motivations, right? Nothing wrong with a motive to try and help our clients, but we rush through, and therefore the clients shut down because they feel that you're not in it for them. By the way, related points, this also has a lot to do with the dynamics of influence. Robert Cialdini, a book I recommend, over 20 years old, still reads very freshly, very easy read, by the way. He lists 6 or 7 factors that determine influence, things like scarcity or all your friends are doing it. But the first one he lists, the #1, is a very interesting one. It's reciprocity. In other words, if I do X for you, you will do Y for me. Well, that's the paradigm of a handshake. That's the paradigm of gift giving. That's the paradigm of almost all forms of etiquette that have some kind of reciprocal thing built in. And it turns out that the subject of trust building and influence very much turns out to be listening. As in, if you listen to me, I will be almost biologically inclined to listen to you. That's the rules of the social game. So think about reciprocity in professional services. As I said, if you listen to me, I will listen to you. Well, this happens to map very nicely into that LFEC model. The critical step, the most important step, and the one that we screw up on, is not spending enough time on that second step. Every time we ask workshops, we say, well, how much time should we ideally spend on listening in a typical conversation? And probably all of you would say more than half, 60, 70%. We all kind of agree on that. You all have to ask yourselves how often you live up to that expectation. Most of us, we get wired into the chase and the excitement, and we kind of want to show how bright we are and how we can solve the problem. And we end up driving that percentage down. But it is a good percentage. Your instincts are right. We need to spend probably more than half of our interactions with clients listening and not doing all the other stuff. A quote from Tom Friedman on this very subject. People often ask me how I, an American Jew, have been able to operate in the Arab Muslim world for 20 years, and my answer is always the same. The secret is to be a good listener. And I love this line. The most important part of listening is that it is a sign of respect. It's not what you hear by listening. It's not the data. It's not the wherewithal to solve your hypothesis. It's the act of listening itself, which is experienced as a form of respect and therefore triggers the reciprocal response on their part to say, well, thank you. Now, tell me what you have to say. So that dynamic, Friedman's talking about political conversations and foreign cultures. Neil Rackham talks about it in sales. It happens in a lot of venues, and certainly it's core to trust building, intimacy in particular. It's more than asking questions. It has a lot to do with empathy and people feeling that you care, that you're trying to understand them just for the sake of understanding them.
Hey, yes, Charlie, I actually have a good question that's related to this that just came up. So somebody asked, if you're trying to create trust, is there a time in the process where intimacy isn't the most important factor?
Yeah, but it changes all the time. I mean, there are times when people say, well, show me what you got, or what do you think, or tell me about your background. We have to answer those questions. So I suppose for a part of a conversation, or sometimes entire conversations, I guess the key thing to think about is, where does the client want to go at that point in the conversation? And they may want to be focused on some other component. But as the question's right, in that we all kind of have to be listening all the time for opportunities and moments when the client is open to, or when we feel something needs to be said about creating intimacy. So is there ever a time when it's not the most important? No, but there are times when you do need to put it on the back burner just to respectfully answer a question. If a client asks you a question, job one is answer it quickly, briefly. If you think it's unimportant, start by answering it, and then you can go on and say, but it's in this context. So even that is an act of respect, which I think also plays to the intimacy. That was a bit roundabout answer. I hope that was helpful. Again, are you listening to collect data or to build intimacy? I mentioned Neil Rackham on sales. This is his actual quote. I asked him, what is the biggest number one sales problem? And he said the most pervasive and the hardest is premature solutions, the mistaken belief that the sooner we can start solving the problem, the more effective we're going to be. So Neil is just another person saying essentially the same thing. When we're in a rush to get through to our material and we're not paying attention and respecting the other party, their reaction is to kind of shut down, withdraw, the polite head nods, the crossed arms, all that kind of thing. So as I said, the problem is accelerating way too rapidly to the answer. The solution is focus on this listening thing, guided by the rule of reciprocity. If you listen to me, I will listen to you. It's incumbent on us to do listening. And by the way, you get an interesting paradox here. The way to get your advice taken, the way to get them to listen to you, is for you to shut up first and listen to them and depend on this baked-in social characteristic of human beings that we tend to return good for good, bad for bad. We reciprocate. If somebody respects us by paying attention and listening to us, we're inclined to do the same back to them. We need to touch on risk here for a minute, if only because in the trustworthiness part, that only deals with the trustee. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's the trustor, the person who takes the risk. If we never play that role, if all we do is focus on the trust equation, then there's a saying for that in sales: we're aggressively waiting for the phone to ring. You don't want to be aggressively waiting for the phone to ring. It's nice to be virtuous. It's a good thing to be virtuous. We should be virtuous, but it doesn't necessarily move the ball forward. So sometimes we have to take a risk to create these environments, particularly again around intimacy. You can't be a trusted advisor without doing both. So very quickly, some idea of trusting. Those of you that are into behavioral economists, they love playing with stuff like short-term and long-term and gain and loss. And at the risk of grossly trivializing their findings, they will say this: we are most motivated by near-term losses, and we are least motivated by long-term gains. Supposedly this goes back to our days running away from saber-toothed tigers. You'd rather get out of the way of the tiger than you'd like to focus on some new grain that's growing over in this interesting grove. So how does that translate into behavior? Well, I would argue that fear is a huge motivator for all of us as human beings, but particularly in the professional services, advisory kinds of businesses that we're talking about here. And there are two kinds of mistakes that we worry about. The first one, let's call it type 1, error of commission, or doing the wrong thing. And the second one, type 2, is error of omission, like not doing the right thing. So two fears: doing the wrong thing, not doing the right thing. Well, the only profession that I can think of that's really driven by number 2 might be a lifeguard. Picture yourself sitting on an Atlantic beach in July, right? And you're a lifeguard, and you see somebody sitting out there or out there in the ocean, waving their arms, going, eh. You think to yourself, maybe they're drowning. Maybe not. I don't know. I'll wait for some more data. Wrong. That's the one job where you are not willing to accept type 2 error. You get out and you run out there, and you hope that you were wrong. You hope that they weren't drowning. They were just playing. Every other job, including, I'm sure, every job of the people on this call, we're driven much more by fear of number 1. We are worried about doing the wrong thing. And therefore, we don't say something. We don't raise a question. We don't step out. We don't say, wait a minute, what is that acronym? I don't understand that. Because, you know, we can all run down the list. They're going to think I'm stupid. It's out of turn. I should have done my homework. They won't like me. I'll look ignorant. What'll I do if, et cetera, et cetera. And so what do? Nothing. Nothing always appears safe, one transaction at a time. The problem is if you consistently do nothing, sorry, Mike here. If we consistently do nothing, you're going to end up committing type 2, an error of omission. So there's a skill that many of you have heard us talk about the elephant in the room, the thing that needs saying that nobody's talking about. And the technique for getting rid of the elephant in the room is basically to call it out. We call it name it and claim it, as in if you name the elephant, you can claim the elephant. It no longer becomes a topic for unconscious, unspoken, renting space in our heads. The technique very simply clarify the issue, like, for example, seems like we're looking at an overrun here, or scope creep. I know many of you know that term. Second step, list all the things you're afraid of. Oh my God, they might think I'm stupid. I might be too early. Maybe this will solve itself. I don't want to embarrass anyone. All those kinds of things, and put them together, step 3, as caveats, led in with the phrase, at the risk of. At the risk of appearing stupid, at the risk of appearing like I didn't do my homework, like raising a question too early, something that might be solved anyway. Nonetheless, I fear we might be having scope creep. That's the technique. I'm not going to go into it in more depth here unless somebody wants to, but that works at a powerful level. It allows us to be the ones that initiate trust, particularly around intimacy, to be the role of the trustor and not just the trustee, which is in the trust equation.
Charlie, we got a couple of questions if you want to pause for them.
Go for it, yes.
So the first is, are there techniques or approaches that help you hear when the client is asking you a question because they think they should, being nice or reciprocal, or when they really still need to be listened to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two answers. Number one, if you suspect that, say it, ask it. And you can construct that by saying, hey, at the risk of taking up a minute here, I just want to check, is that something you're really concerned about, or are you kind of maybe checking a box on that? Help me know what's behind your question. You can say that. And the second thing I'd make is maybe more important, that in a way, all the education and all the socialization and all the stuff that we've learned over the years in education have kind of taken us away from the gut instincts that we learned back in kindergarten. And I find myself telling people more and more, trust your gut, learn to listen to your instincts. Human beings have evolved over eons, and we've gotten very, very finely tuned senses of what's going on with somebody else. We're really good at it. And yet the lesson that most higher education and most business education and corporate training and all that stuff is, don't trust your gut. Wait until it's proven. I've just come to think later in life, no, we are born with pretty good instincts. We would be well served by doing a better job of listening to them. So to answer that question, how do you know? Look inside, feel your gut, and have the courage to sort of phrase a question like, hey, I could be wrong, but I'm wondering where that question's coming from. Would you mind? Something like that.
We have one more question for you. How do you balance waiting to answer, to solve a problem, versus a client demanding that you have the credibility to solve one of their problems before they even talk to you?
I think for you, the reason that we hesitate to give an answer is because we fear it might be incomplete. The problem with saying, wait, I'll get to that in slide 23, or we only talk about that until we meet in person, is that it's disrespectful. It's annoying. If somebody's going to ask you, I want to hear this now, you run a big risk by not telling them right now. It shows disrespect. And yet at the same time, if you do give them the answer and it's incomplete, we worry about that. So here's how you handle it. You answer the question directly and succinctly, very short. If somebody says, how much is this going to cost? You say, low 6-digit number. And you pause. And you wait for them to say, well, how low? And you say, well, it depends. And the question comes back, on what? And you say, great question. It depends on these three factors. The expertise, the length, the criticality, whatever the three factors are. And now you're into having a discussion about what this engagement should look like. So my generic response for that kind of question, answer the question directly and succinctly, and then pause and wait for clarifying questions, which will always come. And as you begin to answer those clarifying questions, you begin to fall into the conversation that you wanted in the first place. So don't hesitate to give a straight answer. And by the way, if the answer is all there is, if there's really nothing more to be said, then why were you holding back on it? Some questions really are like that. I would argue, what are your billing rates? Well, that's a straight question, tell them. I know that's anti-orthodoxy in a lot of big four firms and so forth, but I would argue it'd be good practice. Any other questions before we move off that model?
That's what we got right now. Okay. Keep on rolling.
Okay, good. Let's talk about that third model, the 4 trust principles. And this has to do with, excuse me, if you'd like to build trust in your team or organization, how do you do it? The usual business answer to changing things is to look at competency models and scaling and metrics and incentives and nudges and all that kind of thing. But that is acting at the organization level. And if you go back to my first worldview 30,000 foot slides, the strongest form of trust, the most powerful, tangible form of trust is not at the institutional level, it's the personal level. So we would suggest to you that the challenge is not to create an organization that people trust, because after all, when people say, oh, I trust Apple or Google or FedEx or whatever, what are they really saying? They're not saying anything terribly tangible. So that's not the challenge. The challenge instead is to create a group or team or organization in which people trust and are trusted, where the individuals, all of them as individuals, get good at trusting and being trustworthy. And they practice that in all their interactions with all their stakeholders. That would be a strongly trust-based organization. Most efforts at, trustifying or trust plating or trust proofing operate at the corporate level. Let's get a PR campaign going. Let's get our messaging out. Let's make sure we have processes. That doesn't work at the personal level. And therefore, it doesn't lead to deep trust. So our point of view, I'm speaking for all of us at Trusted Advisor Associates, is that you have to operate at the personal level. That is how you get the deeper trust. So here's the 4 trust principles for those of you that haven't seen them. Number 1, a focus on the client for the client's sake, not for your sake, but consistently focusing for the client's sake. Number 2, a habit of collaboration, a mindset that says we're always on the same side of the table as a client. There are no conflicts, or if there are, they need to be talked about. We raise them so that we're always working on the same side of the table. Third one, a focus on long-term relationships and not on short-term transactions. Now, particularly in business development, this is a huge one because there's all kinds of metrics and systems and funnels and all these things that force us to look at short-term metrics. Well, here's a paradox for you. The best short-term results do not come from short-term behavior. The best short-term results come from long-term behavior, which, by the way, is experienced short-term after short-term after short-term. If you're ever dealing with somebody who's a seller and you're a buyer, you can sense if they're working off quarterly metrics and they're going to have a special this quarter and they want to get your transaction in this month. You can feel that, and it's a turnoff. Whereas if you are consistently focused on the client for the sake of the client, you're not tied to any particular transaction, you're focused on the long term, guess who you want to buy from? And the fourth one, a default to transparency in all your affairs, except where it's illegal, obviously, or hurtful. Now, those 4 principles, if we put them together with the trust virtues that we talked about earlier, the personal trust virtues and the organizational team trust values, together, those 2 really serve to point out how you develop trust in an organization. Sidebar here, some of you may know about Project Aristotle several years ago from Google, who set out to use all Google's massive powers to figure out data crunching, etc. What is the perfect team? And like Google does, they came up with an answer. I would argue it's one of those answers that, again, we learned back in kindergarten. You hardly needed Google to crunch it, although for many people it's very, very satisfying. Their answer, psychological safety, more than anything else, was what drove critical to making a team work. And in that article, they quoted somebody, a lovely quote. I think many of you can relate to this. The thing is, my work is my life. I spend the majority of my time working. Most of my friends I know through work. If I can't be open and honest at work, then I'm not even really living, am I? Now, what that person is talking about, and I know many of you can relate, it's kind of the intimacy stuff, more than anything else. And psychological safety, I think we're kind of talking about the same thing. So here's some, if you like to be persuaded by research, here it is. If you like to think research is just kind of validating what you felt in your gut in the first place and you were right, here it is again. Risk-taking, listening, reciprocity, intimacy, these are all the same themes that we've been talking about at the individual level. So let's round up by talking about leadership. What is a trust-based leader? Someone who creates a trust-based organization. They behave in trusting and trustworthy ways with all their stakeholders. They role model both the trust virtues and the values. They use the language of trust so that people, get to understand it. And this one's critical. They constantly apply the principles, the values to specific situations so that people are constantly reminded, oh, that's right. That's not just something up on the placard hanging in our conference room. This is actually real. And people who tend to manage more by wisdom and exceptions than by adhering to rules and metrics. Quick story, Bill Green used to be the CEO at Accenture. I was with him one day giving a talk to the people at Accenture, and I happened, was allowed in the room for the last 15 minutes of his talk. He was rolling out some new organizational structure and some major reorg. And at the end of his talk, somebody in the room, a guy raised his hand and said, hey, Bill, thank you. By the way, have the incentive structures been lined up yet so that if I get a call from my friend over here in Australia, I'm motivated to help him out? And Bill Green got visibly angry, got up out of his chair, and he pointed to the guy and he said, I never want to hear that question again. If there's ever a conflict between our values and the incentive system, you do the right thing first and fix the incentives later. Am I clear? Well, that's what I'm talking about. 40 people got very clear in that moment. He took some principles and he made them concrete in that moment around a particular issue. I can't think of anything more important than approaching it that way. So when I maybe talk too long here, I want to leave some time for Q&A, but what we've talked about are virtues, behaviors, and values. Those rhyme with our three core models of the trust equation: trust creation, and trust principles. Let me stop there and open this.
The only outstanding question right now is somebody's just asking to look at the 4 trust principles slide again.
Sure, we can zip right back.
Paula, if you have any other questions, feel free to type them in, but we'll leave it up there for a second.
Now, remind me, Jason, can people go off mute here if they want to say anything?
We have to unmute them. I think it's best. This chat feature seems to be working pretty well.
Yeah.
Unless I think for now we'll just use the
okay.
question and answer feature. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to post them either to the question and answer box, or if you want to put them in the chat, we can bring them over there. But that's the only question that we have right now.
Okay, well, let me round out a little bit here by saying we've got some resources for you just to kick through them. We've got more webinars coming up. We've got blogs, we got ebooks, we got videos, we got a podcast. The 3 books we mentioned at the beginning. By the way, that TQ data, the trust quotient, you can take that yourself. There's a free version of it and there's a paid version of it. And we can also get a lot more conversation on social media, not so much on Facebook, but a lot on Twitter and especially on LinkedIn. If you wouldn't mind, if you're still here, give us some quick feedback here. Would you mind rating this webinar? Extremely valuable, very, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We would appreciate it.
We have one more question from David that just popped up. It's
Go ahead.
So the question is, what would you do to accelerate a sales process appropriately?
The first question is, why do you want to accelerate it? Who's that about?
David, I'll give you time to answer that if you want, but right.
Well, you don't need to answer, David. But the first question is check your motives. Why are you trying to accelerate? However, let's assume you got clean motives and it even be good for the client to accelerate.
Quarterly sales quota.
Well, here's what I'd say. Thank you for being clear in that answer. You're going to do the best, unless you plan on quitting at the end of next quarter. You should have a longer term perspective and remember that your best quarterly performance does not come from trying to jam results into that quarter. It comes from constantly focusing on the client and figuring out what their time frame is. And if they are best dealt with by moving that sale to next year, that's what you do. Because that will improve the odds of them buying from you next year. And it'll improve the odds of everybody else buying from you. If you get caught in that trap of quarterly quotas, you're going to get less quota. Let's go right back to Neil Rackeman's spin selling. You know, the focus on trying to get something done actually reduces the likelihood of it getting done. And our attempt to shoehorn our little incentive systems and to shoehorn our clients into that actually destroys the likelihood of them buying from us. So you kind of have to trust a little bit that if you behave in that long-term principled manner, your short-term results are actually going to be better. People are more inclined to buy from you if they don't feel that you're looking at them through the lens of, can I get these guys into this quarter?
So I actually made up the quarterly sales goal. But there's another question that came up. Well, actually, the David he said there's a process. I'm going to go back because he made another note. He said the sales process has been dragging for months, which I think we've all been in that situation where it's
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can have a direct conversation with a client. You can even do this by email and say, hey, I noticed this has been dragging on for months. I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable situation. This happens often. Feel free to tell me if you'd like me to take you off our follow-up list. You know, talk to me. Often, you know, clients are hesitant. They're embarrassed to say, well, it's not like I thought it was going to be, or it hasn't gone as quickly as I'd like. So you can accelerate things by saying, hey, it's okay to tell that to me.
So then the next question, we actually have a whole podcast episode about, if you go to our podcast, which is on the website, but it's how do you repair unintentionally broken trust? How do you rebuild it?
Yeah. First of all, you can. And it's a good idea to do it. Two components there. Number one, you have to acknowledge it. You have to say to the other person, this happened, and I recognize how this destroyed trust, and you kind of have to own your part of it. That's not the same thing as apologizing, by the way. But what's critical, I mean, sometimes you should, but always you should acknowledge whatever your part was in what led to this unfortunate situation and say it to the person. And here's the second point. You have to slightly overdo it. Do not underdo it. Do not say, you know, well, I did this because, and that happened, and it shoulda, coulda, woulda been this way. Don't even go there. If you're going to try and recover lost trust, you need to slightly overdo it so that the reaction of the other person is to say, all right, I see you get it. Okay, all right. Let's not have that happen again. So acknowledge it out loud with you taking responsibility for your part. Let them take responsibility for their part. And number two, overdo it a little bit. You know, like, wow, I can't believe that I did this and that happened, and it must be horrible for you, etc. You want them to say, all right, it's not the end of the world. It's okay. Thank you. Does that make sense?
Sounds good to me. I think we're a couple minutes over, so there's no more questions. And I thanks everybody for joining. As I said, you know, if you guys want to learn more about the resources that we talked about, Charlie just posted them. We're going to send an email out. You get with links to all these resources. There's Charlie's contact information. You're going to get a copy of the deck and the recording, so you can get all this information later. And if we hope to see you at a future webinar, which is on the trustedadvisor.com website. Charlie, anything you want to close it off with?
I just want to thank everybody for coming and hanging out for a while today. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks to everybody who attended. Take care.
Thanks all.